Welcome to the Toll and Stone Podcast. I'm Garrett Ryan, and my guest today is Dr. David Breeze. Dr. Breeze, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be with you today.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. And Dr. Breeze was kind enough to invite me to his home in Edinburgh, as you can see, to discuss the Roman frontiers, his specialty, and a topic on which he's written quite a few books. So I wanted to begin, in very broad terms, by asking, how different was the Roman conception of a frontier from our modern idea of it?
That's a very interesting question because it is very important to try to understand the Roman perspective on life. And for me, when I'm asked this question, one answer I like to give is we must think in terms of how white men, white and they were men, in the 19th century and late 18th century saw the world. It was theirs to take. So most countries in the world had a brush with white empire builders, which has, of course, shaped our world today. So the Romans had a very similar attitude. They saw themselves as the great state, for want of a better word, and the gift that they had been given by the gods was to rule the world. So this is important to understand this. It became very clear under Augustus, the first emperor, who in many ways defined the frontiers of the Roman Empire. But the Romans also saw the frontiers as temporary because the rest of the world was theirs to take when they wanted to. Tacitus remarked many years, decades, perhaps going on for 100, after the Romans had stopped expanding into Germany, Tacitus said, the conquest of Germany is taking a long time. So it was still in his mind, the mind of the imperial aristocracy, that they would eventually get round to conquering Germany, but there was no rush about it. These two aspects, I think, are really important, that the Romans saw themselves as, in time, ruling the whole of the world as they saw it, and also they didn't need to hurry it.
Mm-hmm. Right, so our idea of a frontier is kind of this essential thing, this line in the sand that's there as part of the order of things.
Yes.
It's more a legacy of imperialism than anything else. A 19th century and 20th century idea that the Romans would have found perhaps, a bit strange, if anything.
Well, the other aspect of that is, you're quite right, because basically the Romans were never dealing with equal states, apart from in the Far East, with Parthia, which was then came under a new dynasty and became known as Persia. So against Parthia, Persia, the Romans were dealing with a state which was more or less equal, and very powerful. For the rest, they weren't. They were dealing with kingdoms which they could relatively easily, if they so wished, conquer and absorb into the empire. So there was no such thing, obviously, as the League of Nations earlier in the 20th century, or the United Nations today, which had some sort of, and of course in the Middle Ages, the popes. No sort of supranational body, which the King of Bohemia could appeal to if the Romans came knocking at his door. So it was an absolutely different world in that way from modern nation states.
Mm-hmm. So the frontiers, however defined, developed gradually almost everywhere. And it seems that both their establishment, or at least the idea that they were fixed in a certain place, however temporarily, and their fortification often lasted generations, and was often a sort of a gradual monumentalization, we might say, going from temporary wooden fortifications to things like Hadrian's Wall, at least in one case. And so, can we distinguish phases, I suppose, chronological phases, empire-wide, in the evolution of these defenses?
Yes, we can. If we come back to the point that under Augustus, he pretty well sorted out the boundaries of the empire, which stayed the boundaries, with some changes admittedly, but pretty well stayed the boundaries for the next 300 years more, up to 400 years more. But because at first Augustus was creating a homogeneous empire. So he finished off the conquest of Spain, which had taken a long time. He brought the tribes of the Alps under control. He moved the frontier up to the Danube and so on. So after his death, there was a period when everybody was just really content to sit back and accept things as they were, because it had taken a lot of effort to get that far. But the longer that lasted, it would appear the more that problems developed. So Augustus had left the empire with big army groups in what is now Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, ready to move forward and conquer the rest of Germany. But these required feeding. And it became easier, it would appear, to spread troops out along a line so you had more local supplies. So that's, I think, the first stage, and that comes under Claudius. So we're looking at about 50 AD. That's 2 generations after the death of Augustus. So we have that, and then we have the introduction of smaller enclosures to fill the gaps between forts. That's already started under Tiberius. So Augustus made big change, starting spreading out along the line, but still no linear barrier. And it's really, Hadrian is regarded as the big builder of linear barriers, but it actually started under his predecessor, who started by attempting to fill the gap between the upper waters of the Danube and then the Rhine. And there's a bank and ditch which he built across there. And that seems to be the earliest type of linear barrier which moves on to the frontiers, which Hadrian excelled at producing. And that pattern then moved on to a peak, really, under Antoninus Pius, who was a successor of Hadrian. And at that point, it's as if the pendulum has swung to its furthest extreme and concentrating on a line. When the army, just sticking with Britain, moves back to Hadrian's Wall, doesn't actually adopt the pattern on the Antonine Wall, but moves a little back in time, as it were, in concept, by putting more units in the same number of forts as before. So housesteads, for example, seem to have as many as 3 units based there. So you're moving almost back, though with a major difference, but almost back to the Augustan concept of big army groups. And then it stays pretty well like that throughout the empire until you get major changes in the 3rd century. So from 235 to 284, a lot of invasions, a lot of civil war. The world has turned upside down, and when Diocletian takes over, he makes new arrangements, which a lot of these are about the administration of the empire, smaller provinces, smaller army commands, and mobile field armies. So that's a big change. It's always the tension between defending a line, which is all very well and good, until it's broken through. And then you've got no backup to fight off. It's the same with, in many ways, with the Atlantic Wall built by the Germans. once you break through that, you need, as the Romans did, a backup force, and that's why field armies gradually came into existence in the 4th century, rushing around, fighting threats to the frontier and trying to plug gaps.
So the evolution is from concentration of army groups on frontiers to increasingly dispersed deployments along the linear frontier, and then eventually, having a reserve force of sorts, a field army behind those linear boundaries.
Yes.
Which sounds very logical, from a 300-year perspective. I'm sure it was rather frenzied, time of.
Yeah.
So thinking about the actual defenses themselves, the palisades and forts, how standardized were the defenses, these forts, these fortlets, these walls appearing all over the empire?
Yes. That's an interesting take again on the Roman world. The generalities are very similar. And by that, I mean, we're going to build a linear barrier. That's a concept which comes into being, starts just before Hadrian. Hadrian builds Hadrian's Wall in Britain. He creates a linear barrier in Germany. There's something happening in North Africa, which we know rather less about. And there are one or two other linear barriers, such as in modern Romania. But everyone is different.
Of course.
And the question is, and it's still a really interesting and important question, is who actually is making this decision? I find decision level in the Roman Empire quite fascinating. It's obviously Hadrian saying, right, okay, we're going to have a frontier barrier. But what's his influence in it? Why is Hadrian's Wall so different from others? And how much power over the decisions of location come down to the governor or the general on the spot. And I think this is really very, very interesting. You can follow it on Hadrian's Wall quite nicely because when they came to divide up the work on the wall, it was divided between 3 legions, and each legion clearly was told, right, at every mile you're going to have a little fort, and in between you're going to have a turret, 2 turrets. But when it came to building them, they built each legion built in a different style. So you can see the decision-making process there very clearly. But the emperor still had liked to have great control over what's happening. Under Claudius, very distinguished general, Corbulo, was operating north of the Rhine and was told to pull back by Claudius. So the individual governors realized there was a limit to their power. And you see this very clearly at a most extreme level with Pliny the Younger, the nephew of Pliny the Elder, who was killed at Vesuvius. Pliny the Younger is governor of a province in what is now Turkey. And his letters, or some of them, survive. And he's always writing, even about the smallest things, to Trajan. And you can't quite work out, because this is a unique series of letters. Is this because he's Pliny? And a sycophant. And it could be because eventually Trajan more or less says, oh, get on with it yourself, take your own decisions. Or are we seeing normal life in the Roman Empire? And when we have so little evidence, it's difficult to judge. But the Pliny's letters do indicate a continuing high level of control by the emperor. And we've just got to guess at how this plays out on the ground.
Yeah, I remember reading some of the letters from my own research in a different light. You can see Trajan almost, like going like this, kind of a face plant, or singing a secretary on it. It's like, oh, it's Pliny again. There's another escaped slave in Nicomedia. And actually, that was one of my questions about how important initiative was. Right? It's just hard to distinguish, who was making these big decisions.
Yes.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Another example, if I may, in North Britain, the history of Roman Britain is quite interesting insofar as Caesar came. Obviously, 55, 54 goes quiet. The Roman rulers probably had the idea, well, they've succumbed to us. We'll just leave it at that. We rule Britain because the kings in the south had accepted that. And then Claudius comes along. Claudius wants a triumph. I mean, the only reason for invading Britain is Claudius needed a triumph because he'd come to the throne in really inauspicious circumstances, pulled from behind a curtain, made emperor, and had no military experience. So the Roman Empire is basically military dictatorship. It's a simplified way of looking at it, but there's a lot of truth in that. So he looks around. Well, okay, where are you going to go to get a triumph you can be sure of? There's nothing in North Africa. The Middle East, you're up against Parthia. Bit tricky, that. Europe is vast. Would you really want to get stuck in Central Europe as his brother Germanicus had?
Right.
So he goes for Britain. Okay, it's across the ocean, but they can build ships. Antoninus Pius had exactly the same problem. He chose Britain as well, for the same reason. So Claudius comes along. Once he's got what he wanted, his triumphal arch in Rome, his new coinage, loses interest. And so Nero, his successor, loses interest. Once he's out of the way, the new emperor Vespasian clearly decides he's going to get on with it. He'd been in the army for invasion in 43. Now we're 20 odd years on. He tells his generals, get on with this. We don't know the specific instructions, obviously, except that one of his governors was Agricola. And we know a lot about his career. So Agricola starts off, he tidies up loose ends, and then he heads for the north. He gets to where we think is the Tay. He then falls back, fortifies in some way the frontier line across the Forth Clyde, we are told, and then everything stops. And the stop coincides with the death of the emperor. He faffs around for 2 years, and then the new emperor dies, and his successor went forward in Germany with new conquests, and that coincides with Agricola getting on and marching up again into Scotland. So what we see here, it would appear, is absolute control by the emperor, deciding what to do, what his governors should do, and exactly the same time, we have a really good example again when Nero, a successor, was killed. Vespasian, who was leading the Roman army against the Jewish revolt, stopped what he was doing. This was an internal rebellion. It wasn't an army of invasion outside. It's an internal rebellion. He stops what he's doing and sends to the new emperor and says, what do you want me to do next? And it's about individual power, isn't it? The power is coming from the emperor. Once the emperor's dead or killed or gone, in some way, the governor has to get new instructions from the new emperor.
Right, might cool his heels for a while, consolidate. That's fascinating. Think about how we have this on one side, the notion, as you said, that expansion is what the Romans do, to conquer the world, and rule it, Virgilian style.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's this very practical outlook for the emperors that Britain is a nice manageable conquest. All right, take up a bite-sized chunk, a triumph-sized chunk, and that's all we need. And so in a way that the empire we have is the accident of the individual ambitions of the various emperors.
Yes.
Taking a bit, stopping, taking a bit, stopping.
Yes.
And perhaps underlying that some sort of environmental limits and practical considerations that we probably shouldn't go too much farther this way or that way.
Yes.
But it is fascinating about it. There's nothing natural about the frontiers. They sort of happen for all these political decisions, which are taken for all these different actors for various, individual reasons. You mentioned earlier how the evolution of the frontiers is towards field armies and kind of the limitane, the border, the men on the border. And there was a vogue for a while about this idea of defense in depth, a loot whack and all of that.
Yes.
Does this view, in your opinion, have any historical basis, in terms of grand strategy of defense in depth?
Yes. I think it is just difficult to justify. The Roman Empire, when it came to frontiers, did respond to the local conditions. So, at one end way of looking at it is in Central Europe, in the very early days of frontiers, you did not get forts where there was no people, or whether the landscape was so difficult to cross. And it's the same in the frontier on the Euphrates in Turkey. So there's a response to local conditions. And I think this is important for us all to bear in mind. The Romans were daft, and there's no point putting a fort down. Perhaps when there were no people living there. Though having said that, sometimes you needed a fort where there were no people living there if it was on a potential invasion route. So one's got to be careful with rules, as it were. But across most of Europe and indeed North Africa, the frontier line was a single line. There was, for most of the period of the empire, there was no backup. Britain was different. The province of Dacia in modern Transylvania, in Romania, was different again. In Britain, there were problems in the 2nd century with invasions or threats, and so a largish army was needed. And Britain was very narrow, so you couldn't fit the whole army on the frontier line, so it backed up behind. I don't think the natives were restless. I mean, there's absolutely no evidence for warfare in northern England after the conquest. And there's no evidence in the form of tight network of military installations to suggest that. So what one might interpret as defence in depth is merely a reflection of the geography. In Dacia, again, in this case, the forts tend to be back from the frontier line because the frontier line was the mountains which surround Dacia, especially the Carpathians. I mean, the mountains might have different names today, Musheni Mountains and so on, but essentially they're all the Carpathians and they surrounded Dacia. So the troops are not perched on top of the hill, they're down in the valleys behind. And then they could move forward wherever they needed if there was an invasion coming. So that, again, might be regarded as defensive depth, but for me, it's responding to the geography of the area.
Right. So, trying to draw these essential rules from individual cases is kind of a misleading strategy for this.
I think so. I mean, yes, in later periods, you do get defended barracks inside, but this is to perhaps ignore wider aspects of human nature. So if I could give you an example, which I'd really very much like, towards the end of the Second World War, my father's ship tied up at a Greek island in the evening, and they offloaded the jeep, put it on the dock. Next morning, it had gone. and they searched the island and they never found anything, any part of it. It presumably been dismantled, hidden away. We tend to forget pilfering. If you're an army and you've got lots of food, you might want to have that very well protected. So a lot of food would not be grown on the frontier. It would be grown, like in southern England, and transported, as we know happened, to the Rhineland garrisons. So en route, you might want to have defended granaries. And that's another issue, I think, in looking at was there really defence in depth. And again, it from what we hear, we've got some sites, but there's nothing in the way, really, of a coherent pattern of having, as we've already touched on, an army group like Augustus had, or the mobile armies that came along later, based in a particular place where it could move out in different directions in the face of an invasion.
Oh, that's fascinating. I think that for many of us are familiar with, one little chunk of the frontiers. We tend to kind of extrapolate from that how all frontiers might work, and that's to our peril. So moving on, though, to one particular frontier that you know very well, to Hadrian's Wall.
Yes.
So for listeners who might not be familiar, could you briefly summarize the Wall?
The Wall. Hadrian's Wall is a complicated frontier. It consisted, as initially conceived and started, as a linear barrier which ran from the River Tyne at Wall's End, just downstream from Newcastle upon Tyne, to Bowness-on-Solway, which is downstream on the west side of the country at Carlisle. It was not built of one material alone. The western part of it was built of turf. The eastern miles, 50 miles out of 80 Roman miles, was built of stone, and enormously wide. The foundations are 10 feet wide. No other frontier is like that. And that's something we can come back to. Along this line, there was a defended gate at every mile, called a mile castle, and in between two towers. And before this linear barrier was a big ditch. So that was what was planned. And it's interesting just to look at this scheme, because it was open. It was open in a way. There were gates. I mean, one of the big shifts in understanding Hadrian's Wall occurred in the middle of the 19th century when a gate was found through the wall, a Marcastle gate. Up till then, it was an impermeable barrier, and then suddenly a gate was found, and then of course more, and the interpretation changed overnight. It was realised you could communicate with the people beyond, either in warfare or trade or diplomacy. So having gates through the wall at every mile tells us that this was an open frontier insofar as you could pass through it. The towers are interestingly placed. They are about the same the distance apart as for when you can see somebody approaching is friend or foe, whether they, how they were dressed, what weapons they carried, weapons and so on. So they're very carefully placed in that to maintain observation to the north. So this was the original plan. Some of it was reasonably well advanced. We don't know how much. When there was an absolutely major change. This resulted in, first of all, the addition of new forts to the wall. In the original scheme, there were forts behind the wall, and we can only presume, that the soldiers in these forts behind the wall provided the soldiers to man the wall. Then the new idea was to put forts not just on the wall line, but actually astride the wall. This doesn't occur anywhere else. And it sort of shouts at us, actually, we are going to interfere in the north. Mm-hmm. You know, the fact that you have the forts astride the wall. And when we count up the number of forts, or rather the number of regiments that had to move to man these forts, it's something like 21 units out of the whole lower grade troops, which is 50 to 55 strong in the province. You know, 2/5 of the armies on the move, abandoning forts in Wales, the north of England, to move up and sit astride the wall. 3 forts to the north, extra forts in the hinterland. It's an absolutely fascinating changing attitude from this passive original idea to, if you like, an offensive framework. So we have to ask ourselves, how's this happening? Why is this happening? So what actually happened in 122? We know this because it's in the ancient literature that Hadrian came to Britain. And my guess is, and this is now into historical fiction,
right,
that what had happened is that Hadrian, clearly from the evidence we've got, as soon as he becomes emperor, decides he's not going in for wars of conquest like his predecessor Trajan. Trajan dealt with 2 old sores. One was the kingdom of Dacia in modern Romania. And it took him 2 wars to defeat them, which is interesting. It was a struggle. And then he turned his attention to Parthia, and he was there 2 to 3 years. And then the whole setup collapsed. So we know that Hadrian came to Britain in 122. We're told this in ancient literature. And he came from the Middle East. He became emperor in 117 when his uncle Trajan died. Hadrian could have observed, because he fought in Trajan's army and followed an aristocratic career as an army officer, governor of provinces. So when Trajan died, Hadrian had a lot of experience, and he must have thought seriously about the situation he inherited. Trajan had set out to conquer Dacia, modern Romania. It took him 2 goes to do that. He then moved to Parthia. He might have sacked the capital of Parthia, but he didn't subdue the country as a whole. And it came out in revolt, and revolts within the empire followed, in Alexandria and Cyrenaica in particular. So Hadrian inherited a serious problem which he had to deal with. And from that, I think, that related to 2 decisions which were taken. And the first one was to build barriers like Hadrian's Wall and the Palisade in Germany. The other is to ask ourselves why. One could say, okay, he stopped. He could see the cost in manpower. He could see it didn't actually get them very far in extending the empire. It had become too expensive. And therefore, there may well have been a manpower shortage. There are different days from when the Romans could lose thousands of soldiers in battle in the late Republic. And I think there's a possibility that one of the reasons why we have all these linear barriers is as Hadrian decided he was against any more expansion, and one of the reasons why he was against expansion was it had become too expensive in manpower. So he 4 or 5 years into his reign, he comes to Britain, and we are told by a much later biographer, 200 years odd later, that he was the first to build a wall in Britain from sea to sea, 80 miles long. Okay, that's fine. But of course, the biographer's looking back from 250 years in the future. There's no details in this other than that. En route from Antioch in 117 to Rome, Hadrian came across Turkey to the Danube, and it seems highly likely that he met the governor of the province there, the mouth of the Danube, and appointed him to be governor of Britain. We know his name, it's Pompeius Falco. We know he became governor of Britain, and we know that he retired from that post in July, or shortly before July 122, shortly before the visit of Hadrian. So, this is historical fiction, but Hadrian's already got, because it starts straight away in his head, the idea that he's not going to expand the empire. He's going to hold what he has. He's going to protect it. So he's going to build frontiers. And you could imagine a conversation now. Right. You're Pompeius Falco. I'm Hadrian. Right, old chap. I want to build, seal off North Britain. I want a wall to be built across the north. You say, oh, that's interesting. What do you mean? What kind of wall?
Yeah. Well,
what's in your mind?
Exactly right. Well, first I say yes, sir.
Now that's yeah. Well, of course you say yes, sir.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
What kind of wall? Well, says Hadrian, that's an interesting question. What wall should we have? Now, Hadrian's a great Philhellene. And it's only the Greek east of the empire that actually has city walls. There are hardly any in the west. So if you're thinking, what kind of wall do you want? Well, like round Athens will do, you see. That, says Falco, that's fine.
Yeah, good idea. Right, yes.
Yeah. And it may be as simple as that. Hadrian has an idea, he's quizzed about it, he comes up with something which is so unusual. A 10-foot broad wall in stone for 50 miles. The rest of the wall is turf, which is the usual material of construction in the first phase of fort building and frontier building. Or just earth and bank, or a fence, as in Germany. And when the German fence was replaced, it was by a 2-foot wide wall. So 10 feet, gosh. So that's starts. And there's a section of Hadrian's Wall where it's more ornate. It's clearly very early because they later tweaked the design. And it's very possible that when Hadrian's governor had this built for Hadrian's visit. Do you like this, sir? Is this what you want? It's not what he wanted. Once he was on the spot, I think it's highly possible that Hadrian just looked at the situation and said, no, this isn't going to work in the way I want. So what we're going to do is we're going to put forts on the wall. I misread the situation, he says in his own mind, possibly in his own mind. The Britons had, according to the biographer of Hadrian, were being troublesome. Britain couldn't be kept under control at the beginning of Hadrian's reign. We've got to be very careful here. Because at the beginning of every reign throughout the 2nd century, Britain couldn't be held under control one way or the other. It's a bit like one political party still blaming the last one 10 years on of the economical situation.
Yes.
It might be a literary tropos. It might be reality, and we on that don't have much evidence to help us out. But it does seem very. We should accept. Britain couldn't be held under control. And once Hadrian's on the spot, this becomes more forceful to him. We know that legionary reinforcements are brought in, which says a lot. It means that there's been damage to the legions, we assume, rather than they're just below strength. There are other issues. A soldier centurion is killed in battle, but we don't know quite when. So there is clearly trouble on the frontier. He gets to the spot. He decides he wants it done differently. And that's when it becomes a more offensive, forward-looking, outward-looking frontier. And then there are a whole series of knock-on effects. The width of the wall is reduced. Was there going to be a wall walk along the top originally? Were soldiers going to fight from the top? Well, 100 years ago, R.G. Collingwood argued absolutely not. So the Roman army was an offensive army. It wasn't equipped to fight defensively. Not everybody had bows and arrows. Soldiers only had 2 spears. You're sitting on top of the wall. You throw your 2 spears.
Yeah,
what do you do then? Okay. He regarded Hadrian's Wall as just the top of it, a sentry walk. But it may be that it was planned like Athens with a sentry walk and a wall walk. But once you narrow it, you can't achieve that. And if you look at every reconstruction of Hadrian's Wall, everyone, apart from one I did or had done last year, has a wall walk. But think of it. You're at least 12 foot, probably 15 foot above the ground on a snowy Northumberland winter, patrolling with a parapet in front. You would want one behind, wouldn't you?
Yeah, right.
So you didn't fall off.
Yeah.
And when you've got you reduce the thickness of the wall from actually 9'6" to 7'6", and then you've got a foot off at the big front and back, you're down to 5'6". You haven't got space to throw a spear. You've hardly got space to manoeuvre a shield. And the wall in certain places is even narrower than that. So I think if they even had planned at the very beginning to have a wall walk, it just went out once they narrowed the wall. And there were other smaller changes. And I think as a result of this, actually Hadrian's Wall wasn't finished when Hadrian himself died.
Oh, that's fascinating. That both the amount of dispute there still is over the details of the wall, of the walk, and how apparently profound the personal influence of Hadrian was on this border. That that he says, building a wall looks like this, and the governor says, salutes and says, all right, let's do that. And then can be changed profoundly when he shows up in 122 and says, no, we move the forts forward a bit, and they adjust accordingly.
Yes.
But as you said, by the time Hadrian dies in 138, the wall is not apparently done. It's in fact abandoned almost immediately in favor of another wall, what we call the Antonine Wall, which is not that far from here in Edinburgh. And so you mentioned before how this is apparently Antoninus Pius wanting a nice manageable triumph, advancing the frontiers a bit. But the new wall, the Antonine Wall, is quite different from Hadrian's Wall in a lot of respects. Could you tell us about this?
Yes. It's interesting in many ways. The Antonine Wall goes back to the normal method of building. So it's built of turf. It's built, and the turf is built on a stone base. Now, recent work by colleagues in Edinburgh University have demonstrated that the Antonine Wall was very carefully constructed. There's a lot of discussion as to whether it was a temporary measure, but in order to build the Antonine Wall, on top of this stone base, they collected turf from 2 different places. One was to create a turf curb edge to the wall. The other was different turf to build the wall itself. And the internal turfs are placed not parallel to the rampart base, but diagonally. And that creates a much more stable and cohesive structure. So, and it takes more effort.
Right.
So we're not looking at a temporary fix.
Right, this was
and that I think that's new information, and I think very interesting. and it demonstrates the care that their army went about building the wall. So first of all, it's turf. Then the forts are closer together than on Hadrian's Wall. On Hadrian's Wall, the forts are about 7.5 miles apart, and that's roughly a day's march apart. I beg your pardon. That's roughly half a day's march apart. So there's a sense in that. On the Antonine Wall, that's how they started building. Whether that's all they intended to build initially is still open for debate, but they moved to a much closer density of forts. So they're only 2 miles or just over 2 miles apart in the final scheme. So much closer fort density, with still mile castles, fortlets guarding other gates through the wall. So it ended up with, crucially, different form of construction, material construction, and a much heavier weight of troops in these forts along the line of the wall.
And how much of that is just the narrower isthmus that it's spanning, you think?
The narrowness of the isthmus is interesting. It's roughly half the length of Hadrian's Wall, so it's a much more natural place to build it. And this comes back to Hadrian. I mean, Hadrian could have chose that line for himself. He's not going to conquer the Highlands of Scotland, but if he wanted it to be a tighter frontier, as it were, he could have moved up to the shorter one, but he chose not to. It's an interesting reflection of his conservatism.
Right.
He solidified the position on the existing line. Whereas Antoninus Pius moved forward, I think because he needed a triumph, and that's supported by the fact that he only took the title conqueror, imperator, as emperor for that campaign, in spite of fighting on other frontiers, serious warfare in North Africa. Didn't take any appropriate title for that. When we look at the strength of troops on the Antonine Wall compared with the Hadrian's Wall, it's in effect double. I mean, it's the same number of troops roughly on the Antonine Wall it is on Hadrian's Wall. So it's roughly, in effect, double.
Wow. Of course, after all this effort, this gargantuan effort, that wall is itself abandoned.
Yes.
Almost as soon as it's done, even before it's totally finished.
Yes.
And why is this, that they decide to abandon the new frontier so quickly?
This is, again, it's a difficult question. I think we have to bear in mind that defensive actions, let's say, protective actions changed. They change even today. Since I was born right at the end of the Second World War, and since then Britain has had various defensive weapons. So in the 1950s we had built a rocket range in north of England. We had different planes like F-111s and so on. We've changed the shape of the army. We've looked at aircraft carriers and so on. So today, how we approach the defence of our country and allies is always on the move, changing. So if we translate that back, we perhaps can accept that the Romans could change their minds as well. So, but why? Why? The great problem for us is we're often told why the Romans did conquer the territory. Might not have been altogether the truth. We occasionally have two different views. My favourite is one of Caesar's battles, where we have two different descriptions and they don't tally. So we've always got to be careful with our sources, but we're never told why the Romans gave up any territory.
Right.
So we have to guess. And there are different views. The late Tony Burley suggested that one reason might have been that under the emperor, the most senior officer, the Praetorian prefect, I can't remember that he gave up office or died, late on in the reign of Antoninus Pius. As a result, new brooms acted as new brooms
Right.
and decided, well, we don't need the Antonine Wall any longer. It served its purpose. But at the time the Antonine Wall is abandoned, there are serious actions elsewhere in the empire. There's problems in Germany. We don't quite understand them, but we have soldiers from 3 legions in Britain serving in Germany at this time. So the army is denuded a little bit in the way of its legions, which are the real backbone. We also now know, which is again new evidence, that there were at least 2 auxiliary units, second grade troops serving in the wars in North Africa in the 150s. And this war seems to drag on. And it pulled in troops from across the northern frontier in Europe. And we now know in Britain, including 1 unit from the Antonine Wall.
Really?
So the Roman army in Britain is weakened by wars elsewhere. And it may simply be that at that point it was decided, okay, we're overstretched. We're going to give up the Antonine Wall and move back to Hadrian's Wall. And I can't really do better than that.
Well, that's in itself very interesting, both showing the limits of our own knowledge and how a war 1,000 miles away could draw people down from this wall into these other frontiers.
Yes.
The perils of a world empire, I suppose.
Yes.
So to ask the big question, so whether it's the Antonine Wall or Hadrian's Wall, what is the ultimate purpose of these walls? So that there's gates, which is so interesting.
Yes. Well, a few years ago I wrote a paper and I offered going off for 20 reasons which archaeologists and ancient historians had given for the purpose of Roman frontiers. Some of which one might be easily ruled out. I'm not altogether convinced that they were displacement exercises. You don't want soldiers with nothing to do. They become restless and mutinous, and that's not a good thing. And our ideas change over time. We live in a world today which is trying to control access to its territory. We see it across the Atlantic. We see it in Europe. We see it even within the EU countries building barriers to movement of people. And the Romans like to control access to their territory. So in the years shortly before Hadrian's Wall was built, we have 2 very nice and helpful references. They both relate to what is now Germany, and one of them is based on Cologne. And the tribe which lived beyond Cologne complained that they were only allowed to go into Cologne to trade if they went in unarmed under military escort, entering at places stipulated by the Romans and travelling to markets stipulated by the Romans. Another is a bit further along, where it's a very similar complaint, a bit further east, of a tribe complaining in the same way. So we can see in what is today Germany, Western Europe, that there are 2 instances in Roman literature where people living beyond the frontier had to follow Roman regulations in order to enter the empire. The second example is in the Eastern Empire, and a little later, two generations or so later, in the late 170s and 180. And there'd been a serious fighting across the in Central Europe. And as a result of this, there were treaties signed in the late 70s, 170s. And first of all, the Romans said, okay, you are the people of the states beyond the Danube, beyond the empire, couldn't come to within 10 stades of the bank of the Danube. But that didn't work. So a year or two later, there was another treaty. Okay, 5 stades. You've got to keep 5 stades away. And then the final treaty says, okay, we'll let you come up to the bank of the Danube, but you can't come onto the islands. This is fascinating in two ways. We see that Rome is trying to control what's actually happening immediately on their border. And the second aspect is they're not achieving that.
Right, yes.
And then the detail is interesting. Okay, you can come in, but want to come in. We don't trust you. You might be masquerading and actually be spies. So this is fascinating. 2 examples. Now, for me, I like a third example of anything. You know, one action is just a happenstance. 2 is a coincidence. 3 is a fact. So I need 3. And that my third example will be the Eastern Frontier, the desert region of Egypt. And there were a lot of roads crossing the desert from forts like Berenike on the Red Sea, where they're bringing in high quality luxury goods from the East. And the Romans could see this was actually a balance of payments problem, but
Right.
these were luxury goods. And there were roads which were protected by small forts right the way across the desert, coming to the Nile, usually at Koptos. And at Koptos, we have an inscription which tells you what civilian travellers across the desert had to pay as a fee, and presumably in return for that, they got protection by Roman soldiers. What we also have written on pieces of pottery are passports, permits to pass, which might say, I'm making this up, Oppius Sabinus, in charge of the fort at Berenike, gives permission to Hermogenes and his wife and 2 children and a donkey to pass to the next fort at Dionysus, where he must hand this to the man in charge, Julius Sabinus. Now, this is really tight control, isn't it? My mind's picture, is that the Romans wanted to control access to their territory and within the frontier zone movement. This comes to a head in the late 4th century when the Emperor Valentinian was approached by groups of what they call barbarians from beyond the frontier, who wanted to come and enter and settle in the Roman Empire. And he got so cross that he actually had a seizure and died. But it was, oh my gosh, these people, they want to come and settle in my empire. And it was about control again. So I think when we're looking at the empire and we're looking at the gates through it, in part we're looking at regulation. Having said that, there's a lot of new thought coming into play, which is looking at the structure of frontiers and using evidence again from a variety of parts of the empire, including North Africa, from modern Libya, where there's one of these inscriptions talking about the tall towers of the fort wall that forts and surviving at Regensburg, for example, in Germany, are built to impress, intimidate the people outside the empire. They're symbolic of the strength of Rome. And this is simply another way of looking at frontiers and what they're trying to achieve, which is two sides of the same coin, isn't it?
Sure.
We're in charge.
So it is right, both a statement of power and a practical way of controlling both the flow of people through and customs, of charging customs duties if need be.
Maybe, yes.
Yeah, and at least in some places.
Yeah.
And so Hadrian's Wall is sort of a fusion of these things. It has these gates which control motion or movement through. It is impressive. It has this monumental. And I read somewhere that they think it may have been stuccoed and painted. I don't know if that's true or not. But,
we're not quite sure. There is evidence in the form of documents from the Eastern Empire of painting or mortaring the outside of fort walls. And you're right about the gates. See, the gates of the Marcasses on Hadrian's Wall are a little grander than those of the forts. So these are the original gates were shown to be grander. And that's coming back to a symbol of power again.
Right.
These are the gates that people would have had to go through to come into the empire.
Well, it is fascinating. And this whole story is fascinating. So, Dr. Brees, thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful discussion. And to everyone listening, Dr. Brees is the author of one of the standard guides, Hadrian's Wall, and other books on the Roman frontiers. Check them out wherever books are sold and, of course, online. Well, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for your stimulating questions.
I do what I can. And to everyone listening, thanks so much for tuning in.